John chapter 1, we've talked about a lot of key words that John is using in this gospel. We've talked about we've talked a lot about logos, that mind, the supreme mind that the Greeks and the Romans believed in. We talked about a little bit last week about light and how John, in John chapter 1, he goes through talking about that this logos, that it was the light of men. It is the true light, he says. And so in a way of trying to introduce the idea that there are a lot of different lights around you. There are a lot of different ideas, people are believing around you. And as we consider the Greeks and the Romans and all the different beliefs that they had, and John's saying, but the one I'm going to tell you about is the true light. And they connected light with truth, being enlightened. And so that was a very common Greek idea and thought. I wanted to, in chapter 1 and verse 10, I want to kind of start here tonight with, we talked about this idea of logos, how in your Bible it's going to use the word him because the translators are translating it because we already know that it's referring to Jesus. But in the original text and with the use of logos, it probably was more accurately translated it, considering the ones that it's being written to. Yes?
Remind me, Rick, how many genders does the Greek language have? Does it have masculine, feminine, and neuter?
Yes.
Or does it have, okay.
Yep. It has three, and you don't see the neuter very often. It's mostly masculine and feminine, but there is a neuter as well. And so I think the pronoun that's used here, I think, is the word auto, and so that can be used. That can be translated either he, she, or it. And so since logos is what it's modifying, it would be it, because they don't understand yet that this is going to refer to a person. And so, and we spent a lot of time a couple weeks ago talking about that. So in verse 10, literally the way a Roman Greek reader would read this would probably be, it was in the world, and the world was made through it, and the world did not know it. So this supreme mind was in the world, and the world was made through this great mind of some kind, but the world did not know it, didn't comprehend it. And I want to kind of focus here a little bit on this word world. This is another key word that the Romans and the Greeks, they would have been very familiar with, and the way that John uses it is very specific and intentional. What we will see in this gospel is that John is going to develop the word world to refer to those who live in darkness and do not have light. So he's introduced this light, and now he throws this word world in, that the world did not know him. And throughout the Gospel of John, and even in his letters, he's going to use this word world, and it's going to refer to people who are living in darkness, people who do not have the light, at least yet. And so think about some other passages in John. There's a very, very, very popular passage in the Gospel of John that uses the word world. You think what it is? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And so, again, we see with that context, John's going to use that idea. God loved every human being in the darkness that they were in this dark world. God loved the world. And because of that love, he sent his only son. And there are other places. If you think about John chapter 15, Beginning in verse 18, Jesus says to the apostles, he says, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this the world hates you. So you put that again, put that idea, concept of what John's going to be doing, the world, those that are living in darkness. Those that are in darkness, they hate you, but they hated me first. And so if you were of the darkness, then the darkness would love you. But because you're not of the darkness, I chose you out of the darkness. He says that's why the darkness hates you. And so that's the way that John is going to be using that. Let's look at one more. This is in his letter, 1 John 2. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. It's from the darkness. The world is passing away, and also its lust, but the one who does the will of God lives forever. And so John's going to use this not just in his gospel, but all the way through all his letters. He uses this terminology a lot as well. So in this first paragraph in John chapter 1, everything that we've seen so far, John is using a bunch of keywords. Logos, life, we looked at a couple weeks ago, light, darkness, world. These words are important for us to get a good understanding of the whole rest of the gospel. As we see these things appear throughout the gospel, and to just try to see it through the eyes of what a Greek citizen, a Roman citizen, what would they think when they saw this and when they read these things? And to see how John begins to mold those thinking, those teachings, into helping them understand more about who Jesus really is. And that's what he's going to do. I want to read John 1, I guess I'll put it up here, verses 10 through 13. And then I'm going to pause. We're going to talk about some things about Roman mythology. And then we'll come back to this, and I think you'll see how that all fits into what John is saying here. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. I'm currently taking an online course on Greek and Roman mythology. And as I read through these three verses, it is line after line after line after line concepts that connect directly to Greek mythology and what they would be thinking about God or gods. And what John does here is incredible. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to just kind of talk about Greek mythology a little bit and see how that relates. Again, these are the people and their beliefs that John is writing to. So for us to understand best why he's saying what he's saying, we need to know about the people. And so I'm not going to go into depth on this, but spend a little bit of time. So Greek mythology is the story-rich religion of the ancient Greek people and later the Roman people. And a lot of it's familiar to us today. There are a lot of things that we pull out of Greek mythology, and I don't think we realize how much it is. But the names and the antics of their gods and their demigods and their heroes, they've all made their way into our culture too. About the Apollo space program. It's named after Apollo, the Greek god Apollo. Apollo is the god of the sun, the god of light. Ended up later on being known as the god of music and poetry and archery and art and agriculture and order and beauty. A lot of things that Apollo is connected to. And Apollo is often depicted in art as the ideal male specimen. And it's a strong, muscular, athletic build. That's the way statues and things of him are made. And as I'm putting pictures together of all these Greek gods, it was a challenge to get pictures that were suitable for showing in a Bible class, because most of them are naked. So I did very well. Keep this on maybe a PG level. Apollo had a twin sister, and we know about her. We just don't realize it was his twin sister, again, in the mythology, and that is Artemis, the god of Ephesus, the goddess of Ephesus that we read about in Acts chapter 17. The Romans later called her Diana. And so, if you have been to Washington, D.C., you have seen several statues of the goddess Themis. And Themis is the Greek goddess of law and justice. So at the entrance of the U.S. Supreme Court building, that top picture, there is a statue of the Lady of Justice, which is Justinius, who is the Roman name for her. And if you notice, in her right hand, she's holding another statue, and that is the statue of the Greek goddess Themis. So it's the goddess Themis holding the goddess Themis is kind of really what we've got here. But there's also the bottom picture. That is a statue of the goddess Themis at the Union Station in Washington, D.C. I believe there are about 6 statues of Themis in the city of Washington, D.C. Greek goddesses all over the place. What day is today? Today's Wednesday. On Monday afternoon, I happened to be in Nashville, Tennessee. And I mentioned when we were talking about Athens, if anybody had seen the Parthenon that had been built in Nashville, I never had. And Bill and I were driving through Nashville, and on the way back, I said, "Would you mind taking a detour for a second? There's something I'd like to see." And so we stopped just for a few minutes and walked around the outside. This is a life-size building, replica of the Parthenon that's set on the Acropolis in Athens. It was the temple for the goddess Athena, and so that is there. We didn't go inside, but that is inside a picture they have in 1990. Now, okay, Arkansas historians, when was that building, the Parthenon in Nashville, built? Anybody know? I was shocked. It was built in 1897. Nashville had, I guess, become known as the Athens of the South, a name that it had gained. So they decided to build this, and then in 1990 they had that statue of Athena placed inside it, and just looking at it kind of gives me the willies. But it is a massive building. We saw the ruins of the original one in Athens, and when you see it all put together and everything, it's quite incredible. But that's Greek mythology, Greek gods, and Roman gods right there as well. Other things that you've heard of. You've heard of Pandora's box. You've heard of the golden fleece. You've heard of Achilles' heel. You've heard of Hercules. You've heard of the Trojan horse. These are all Greek mythology, Greek stories. You heard of Zeus and his lightning bolts that he throws. You've heard of Hermes, the god that has winged shoes, so he's able to fly. He's a messenger of the gods, is what his role is. What's kind of interesting, though, when you look at all these gods that they worship, Despite all the colorful stories, we have to remember that many people in the ancient world worshiped these false gods and goddesses. This was an important part of their life. They believed these weren't just fake stories to them. It was real to them. They believed every bit of it. And we get a little bit of a taste of that in Acts chapter 14. In Acts 14, beginning in verse 11. Turn over there with me if you would. Acts 14. It says, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, he has just performed this miracle of healing this man who was lame. When the crowds, he's in Lystra on the first missionary journey. The crowd saw what he had done. They raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have become like men and have come down to us. And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. So you see, Zeus is the head god. He's the guy that's over everything. But Hermes is the son of Zeus in Greek mythology. And Hermes was, to the Greeks, he was the messenger of the gods. Well, amongst Paul and Barnabas, who was the one who was doing most of the speaking, most likely? It's Paul. He's the one preaching. And he's the one, and so they naturally connected. They see the miracles performed. They naturally connect. This has to be God. They have to be gods to be able to do this. And he's doing all the speaking, and he's telling us that this is a message from God, so he must be the god Hermes. So you see how they're making these connections. It's very, very real to them. And it goes on, verse 13, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. See, this is what we talked about before with the worship of the gods, was they knew that if they were going to be able to please the gods, that sacrifices and offerings to those gods were necessary. And they honestly believed that if they did not offer correctly and what they wanted and enough, then the gods would bring down destruction and failure in their lives, and they wanted the gods on their side, and so that's why they're doing all of this. In verse 14, it says, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. So Paul immediately turns his message to, I am telling you about the one God that made everything. I'm trying to get you to see that all these other gods that you're even trying to say that we are, they're not real. We're trying to get you to see what the one true real God is. But this is reality. This is the world they lived in. And so we see that appear. It's just, I've read that a lot of times and I've seen it and we've talked about it. But until now, I didn't really understand just how important these things were to these people. So these deities were objects of fear and veneration. And they affected their cultures throughout the large region over which the Greek influence had spread. And the Romans, who said later, they're going to adopt the collection of all the Greek gods. And many times they change their names. They give them Romanized names, like Artemis is Diana. And they do that with a lot of their gods. But they're the same ones. The Greek myths, as I said, they're not fictional to these people. They were explanations for how the world came to be. All the mythology and all the stories that have been told throughout the centuries, that was what they believed was real history of how everything came about. It was their way of explaining why we have storms, why we have disasters, and why mankind suffers, and what awaits us after death. They have all these stories that go with all that too. And so Patron gods and goddesses were the special objects of worship among those who longed for blessings and protection from the events of life. So in the city of Athens, Athena was the patron goddess. And so everybody in Athens worshiped Athena because she was the one who would bring blessings upon their city. And if there was somebody in your family that got really sick, or if somebody who died tragically, or if your business failed, or whatever it may be, it was because the gods were unhappy with you. There was no other explanation in their world. It was either the gods are making you successful and helping, or the gods are going to ruin you and give you the consequences of whatever that tragedy is. There was no other belief and thought in their world as to why all those things happened. All human skills and technology, they're always attributed to one of the gods. If you were a master craftsman of some kind, it was because there was a god specifically to that craft that was blessing you and gave you an ability. If you were a master weaver, if you were a farmer that was successful, maybe you were a builder of musical instruments, and you had that ability and were very good at it, there were gods connected to that. And so that's the world of the people and the beliefs that John is writing to. Humans in Greek myths are often made to suffer when they fail to offer the prophet homage and sacrifices. And so that's what they believed. Or if a human was to try to elevate their talents above that of their patron god and basically take it on, it's like, no, it's me that is, I studied and I trained to become this good. They believed that was usurping the authority of the god. The only reason you have that ability is because one of those specific gods gave you that ability. The Greek gods would also take on different forms sometimes, manifestations. The goddess Gaia was said to be the earth itself. So the earth that we live on is the goddess Gaia, the divine creator. But then she's manifested in the mountains and in the valleys and all the rocks and stones and everything. That was the goddess Gaia. But Gaia also at times in their mythology took on human form. And she walked around, which is where we get the idea today of Mother Nature. It came from the goddess Gaia. There was a margarine brand back in the 70s. I can't remember what it was called. But the commercials for it were, it's never good to upset Mother Nature, or something like that. And it was margarine, which was fake, but even Mother Nature couldn't tell that it tasted any different than butter, which had to have been a lie, especially in the 70s. Mother Nature didn't have very good taste buds. But Zeus became the god in charge of everything, and according to mythology, is because he rescued all of his sibling gods from their cannibalistic father Kronos. And so that's the story that was told. And I say, they believed it. They believed that every word of that was true. Zeus, he chose to be the god of the sky, the god of the storms. His brothers, Poseidon and Hades, they took to ruling over the sea. Poseidon over the sea. Hades was the one who ruled the underworld. The terminology that's used in the Bible, when we see the word Hades, it's there for a reason, because it is connected with ideas that the Greek and Roman people already had. They may not have been correct ideas, but they had at least some idea of the concept of an underworld and afterlife that was involved with those kinds of things. But when it came to Zeus to accomplish his own self-interests and self-goals, sometimes Zeus often took other forms, including sometimes human form. And they believe that happened. So when Paul and Barnabas show up in Lystra, it was not a shock to them that this might be Zeus and this might be Hermes. Because sometimes in the mythologies, they would refer to it as in history, the gods took human form. And when they did, usually there were tremendous blessings that took place for the people that were involved. And so that's why they wanted to offer the sacrifices and please the gods as much as they possibly could. Dionysus, one of Zeus's sons, while weeping over the death of his close friends, his tears began to turn to wine. Well, Dionysus, known in Roman mythology as Bacchus, he shared his new creation of wine with mankind and became the god of wine. Zeus was known for his many sexual encounters with various goddesses and even some human women. That's the one thing that John's going to do. We don't see it as we're reading through it. But if you're reading it like a Greek or a Roman, and the way that John talks about God, you will begin to notice that he is making very distinct comparisons and contrasts between the immoral, selfish, self-centered gods that they served and a completely different God that he's introducing them to. And that's happening all the way through the Gospel of John. The Greek poet Hesiod, he compiled a long list of all the mortal women who had relationships with gods and the children who were born from divine and mortal couples. So they believe the gods come down to get women pregnant. Those children would be demigods. They'd be half god, half man. And in Greek and Roman cultures, the most powerful and aristocratic families, and even some entire cities, traced their lineage back to these half-god, half-human ancestors. That gave them status. If my lineage traces back to a god, that's going to make me important and powerful and have status. This is what ultimately led to the Greeks and the Romans rationalizing the belief that some of them, especially those in power, like emperors, were from divine origins. And it led them to thinking that they themselves were gods that should also be worshipped. That's where the whole idea of emperor worship came from, is the emperors believed that either they themselves were the son of a god, or that they were their ancestor somewhere was a son of a god. And again, they believed it 100%. It wasn't myth to them. It was history. And that's why they were so involved with it. Okay. I was going to read Romans 1:20. It shows the thinking of them at that time, but I want to go back to this real quick. Look at some of the statements that are here. He came to his own. So a God that came to his own. See, or it. We're talking about the Logos. Was in the world. The world was made through him, and the world did not know him. This was not strange for them to think of Logos and whatever that might be coming into the world. That's not really strange. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. That's a huge Roman religious thinking, because you were important if you were a child of a God. And here John is saying that God was going to give the right to some to become children of his, even to those who believe in his name. So it's about faith and belief and trust. It's not about how you were born. Notice what verse 13 said. Who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh. Doesn't have to do with who you were physically born from. It doesn't have to do with the will of flesh. It has nothing to do with your status and the will of man wanting to be seen as important. It's not what it's about. But of God. It is all about what God sets the standard. And God says, if you believe in my name, if you believe in my authority, if you believe in who I am, and this is obviously talking about the Logos, talking about who we're going to see, we know is Christ. If you believe in him, then you have the right to be a child of God. You have the door into real status. The most important status is to believe in the Logos. And so that's what he's getting to. He's using all of these, even the mythology ideas. He's using all of that to lead them closer to the truth about what God really is. And we see all of that right there in just those first few verses of John chapter 1. A lot of cool stuff. And I skipped over a lot of stuff that is also there. But if you go through it slowly and you start understanding what the Roman culture was like, these things start flying off the page of how John is making these connections. And it's really, really cool. And I'll be doing my best to try to bring some of those out as we continue through the book.